Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, Program Director here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third and final event in our Faith in Art series for spring 2021. The Harvard Catholic Forum seeks to share the riches of Catholic thought and culture with the academic, artistic, and professional worlds of Cambridge, Boston, and beyond. In addition to our lectures, we offer non-credit courses and are continuing to broaden our programming. The forum is a project of the Harvard Catholic Center, St. Paul's Parish, Harvard Square, and the St. Paul's Choir School. Together, we make up a vibrant Catholic presence in the midst of the Harvard campus. Check out our website at www.harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our newsletters and register for future events. And please consider supporting our important mission by making a financial contribution there. This event will be archived by the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with friends, colleagues, parishes, or chaplaincies that may be interested. Our post-talk YouTube participation usually exceeds the numbers we are able to reach on day one. We are honored to have as our co-presenter for this series, the Lumen Christi Institute. Since 1997, Lumen Christi has been enriching the intellectual and cultural life of the University of Chicago and beyond with the insights of Catholic thought. Other co-sponsors from around the country include the New England chapter of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museums, the Collegium Institute Vivendi Initiative at the University of Pennsylvania, the St. Benedict Institute at Hope College, the St. Paul's Catholic University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the St. Lawrence Institute for Faith and Culture at the University of Kansas, and the Nova Forum and Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. After tonight's program, you will receive a questionnaire. It would be a great help to us if you would return it to us and give us your feedback. Before I introduce our speaker, let me give you a roadmap of today's event. The lecture segment will last 30 minutes or so, and then we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to send it to us. Today's presentation looks at an explosion of artistic creativity that expressed the abounding love of peoples throughout Latin America for the Virgin Mary during 3 formative centuries following the introduction of Christianity to the continent. Our speaker, Gauvin Alexander Bailey, is Professor of Art History and Bader Chair in Southern Baroque Art at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. He received his PhD in Fine Arts here at Harvard and has taught, published, and lectured widely on Baroque art and architecture, along with their hybrid forms in different cultures. His work covers Latin America, Southern Europe, and Asia. He has published numerous articles and 9 books, including Art of Colonial America, 2005, and The Andean Hybrid Baroque, Convergent Cultures in the Churches of Colonial Peru in 2010. The U.S. Postal Service retained Professor Bailey as its consultant in the choice and design of its 2020 Christmas stamp featuring the Virgin of Guadalupe. Professor Bailey, will you unmute and turn your video on?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank first Deacon O'Donnell and the Harvard Catholic Forum for the invitation to speak today. I will now share my screen. When I was asked to give a lecture about the role of the Virgin Mary in colonial Latin America, It was more a question of what to leave out than what to include. With the possible exception of Christ, no other sacred figure was as beloved or represented so widely as Mary, in all stages of her life and in all of her manifold apparitions and advocations, from the Virgin of the Apocalypse to the Virgin of Candlemas. In fact, Argentine scholar Hector Scanone wrote a 650-page encyclopedia just on the iconography of the Virgin in Latin America. By comparison, his volume on Christ is 300 pages shorter. Mary also arrived in the Americas at the very beginning, as conquistadors like Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, today's Mexico City, under her banner in 1519, a tradition that continued as Spain conquered Central and South America. In fact, such banners explicitly referred to the Virgin as La Conquistadora, or the Conqueror. Most of them are long gone, but this is the earliest surviving banner of the Virgin as La Conquistadora, painted by Jesuit missionary Louis Berger and used on the missions known as reductions in Paraguay as a symbol of Christian conquest and the triumph of the church. The banner is quite typical, showing a full view Virgin of the Apocalypse surrounded by sun rays. The earliest missionaries, whether the Franciscans in Mexico or the Jesuits in Paraguay, made ceremonial entries into indigenous territory behind similar banners to announce the arrival of the new faith. But Amerindians soon claimed her for themselves, and images of the Virgin with darker skin began to proliferate, as did sculptures of the Virgin who appeared miraculously to indigenous peoples. What I propose to do today is to give an overview of colonial Latin American art through the iconography of the Virgin Mary. We don't have time for the whole story, but a selection of representative images of the Virgin will allow me to sketch it out in broad strokes. We begin here in the former Aztec Empire in 1531, 10 years after Cortés's conquest of Tenochtitlan. This painting on amate, a type of fig bark paper that has been manufactured in Mexico since the pre-Hispanic era, is the oldest depiction of the Virgin Mary in Latin America. And it was executed by a Nahua Amerindian picture writer. The Nahua were the indigenous people of central Mexico. It is in fact part of an 8-page court document, a testimony in a legal case against representatives of the colonial government in Mexico by the people of Huejotzingo, a small village to the southeast of Mexico City. The Aztecs used pictograms as their writing system, and the Nahua people continued to use pictures for decades after the conquest in legal documents of this kind. It might seem ironic, but the lawsuit was on behalf of Hernán Cortés, with whom the Huejotzingo people had collaborated in the overthrow of the Aztecs, as did several tribute peoples of the former empire. Cortés sued the judges of the Mexico City court for demanding excessive tribute from the Amerindians under his jurisdiction, and they won an unprecedented victory in court. The document, several pages long, includes depictions of the money, goods, and labor that the Huejotzingo villagers were forced to submit to the government. The Madonna and Child is in fact a representation of a banner that the villagers made, one of these depictions of the Virgin I just spoke about as La Conquistadora. But here the banner was executed in bird feathers, which you can see lined up above her, an ancient Aztec medium, which I will return to in a minute. What is fascinating is her style. The features of the Virgin and Child are heavy, as if sculpted, reflecting the importance of sculpture in the round in Aztec religious culture. Of special interest is the skull-like face, which recalls sculptures of the deity Cihuateotl, a female figure with a skull-like face and large circular eyes. Look also at the curling claw-like hands. Cihuateotl was a deity of women who died in childbirth. While this deity obviously is very different from the Virgin Mary, the fact was that they both had to do with childbirth, and Nahua artists looking for a model for this new mother and child deity from Europe fell upon something that seemed equivalent to them. This shows that at this early stage, artists were still learning how to interpret the figural style used for representations for their new religion by basing them on forms that they had executed for their old one. Something of a similar aesthetic prevails in this sculpture of the Virgin of Sorrows at the foot of the atrial cross at the Augustinian mission at Acolman, near the ancient pre-Aztec site of Teotihuacan, and carved in the mid-16th century. Here she possesses the bulkiness of Aztec sculpture, with a skull-like face. An actual skull sits at the bottom, and typical heavy beveled drapery. This is a fascinating interpretation of Mary that is a world apart from her image in Western European art. The very same year that Huayotzingo artists were sorting out how to paint an image of the new Christian Mother of God, a miraculous event in what would be called Guadalupe in the outskirts of Mexico City introduced the image that remains the single most important and beloved image of the Virgin Mary in Latin America. More importantly, she was the first version of the Madonna whom Amerindians claimed as their own. A delicate late Renaissance style depiction of the Virgin of the Apocalypse. She has enigmatic gray lavender skin, which has inspired generations of Amerindians and mixed race people to accept her as a member of their own ethnic group, although she was equally beloved by Creoles or Caucasians born in the Americas. The story goes that in December 1531, a Nahua boy named Juan Diego was walking on Tepeyac Hill, and the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to him, a young woman with black hair and brown skin who spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. She told Juan Diego to go and tell the Bishop Juan de Zumárraga to build a church on this hill, but the bishop was initially skeptical. The Virgin made 4 more apparitions to Juan and to his uncle that same month, and in the last of them, she told him to go and pick some flowers that had miraculously appeared on the hill to take to the bishop as proof. Juan Diego gathered them into his tilma or cloak, and when he opened the cloak to show the flowers to the bishop, the painting we see today had been imprinted on its inner side. On 26 December, the bishop organized a procession to transfer the miraculous image back to Tepeyac Hill, where it was installed in a small, hastily erected chapel. Nearly 2 centuries later, a massive Baroque shrine was built on the site, and the Virgin, barely visible in the center left of this painting, was processed into her new home in one of colonial Mexico's most extravagant ceremonies, involving dancing, fireworks, and theatrical performances, including performers on stilts representing allegories of the 4 continents, which you can see on the lower left-hand side of the courtyard to the left of the church. Copies of the Virgin of Guadalupe proliferated throughout the colonial era and beyond, as did paintings of the miracles taking place. As in this anonymous Mexican painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Juan Diego's cloak from 1737, showing the flowers spilling out of it, or this unusual iconography by Joaquin Villegas, demonstrating the miraculous origins of the painting by depicting God the Father as the artist. The Virgin of Guadalupe is an example of an ajeropoieton, or an image not made by human hands. This is why God is depicted as the author, although it was much more common, as we shall soon see, to show Saint Luke painting the Virgin. Another kind of image of the Virgin that enjoyed immediate global renown was made entirely in the Aztec technique that had formerly been restricted to temple adornments and ceremonial and military costume, the feather painting or feather mosaic. Feather painting was a highly skilled, painstaking, and expensive medium that was so valued by the Aztecs that the court kept special aviaries of exotic birds to supply feathers. Known as amanteca, Nahua feather workers collaborated on a single artwork, making individual squares that were then sewn together like a quilt. They knotted feathers onto a base of small wooden strips, or glued them individually onto a sheet of paper made of cotton and paste and attached to a bark backing. The glue was extracted from orchid bulbs. The feathers were attached like a mosaic, overlapping roof tiles, in fact, beginning with the plainer ones and finishing with the most brilliant. The most luminescent, those greeny blue ones you see there, came from the quetzal bird, now found in Guatemala. Very soon after the conquest, Spanish missionaries realized this magnificent medium could be used to produce Christian sacred pictures, like this 16th century Madonna of Sorrows. The earliest colonial feather paintings were banners on a cotton cloth with the backing of fine palm or rush mats, bound with twine or lianas, which is a kind of tropical vine. And in fact, this is what's depicted in that Huayotzingo Codex that we just looked at. Feather workers would transfer the design from an engraving and then use it as a background for their feather painting. They were extremely popular at the courts of Europe, and examples can be found today at the Uffizi in Florence and the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, among many other places. Perhaps the most famous image of the Virgin Mary by an indigenous artist is Our Lady of Copacabana, housed in the shrine of that name on the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca. Located near a shrine that had been venerated since pre-Inca times that was related to the origin of humankind, Copacabana became an essential site for Christian proselytization, acquiring the sacredness of its predecessor. The statue of the Virgin, a Virgin of Candlemas, is the work of Andean sculptor Francisco Tito Yupanqui, a descendant of the Inca Huayna Capac. He first made a Virgin in clay, which the head Augustinian friar of the church rejected as being too ugly and amateurish. So Francisco Tito went to the silver mining town of Potosi, and he studied in a sculpture workshop so that he could make an acceptable statue of the Virgin. The wooden statue he completed was indeed accepted in 1583, and is now South America's most revered Marian image, one incidentally that gave the name to that famous beach in Rio de Janeiro, which once had a chapel devoted to this image. The Virgin of Copacabana owes her popularity to her Andean origin, made by a descendant of the Incas on the site of an ancient shrine. Today, it is especially popular with taxi drivers who drive their cars there in the hundreds to be blessed. Here's an example, barely recognizable as the same figure, of one of the hundreds and perhaps thousands of depictions of the sculpture made in 17th and 18th century Cusco and elsewhere by Andean painters who had their own guilds and confraternities. Typically of the school, the image is overwhelmed by a rich background of lace, golden ribbons, silver filigree, flowers, textiles, and pearls. These materials appealed to the painters of Cusco, who inherited an Inca and pre-Inca tradition of making fine textiles and silver and gold work. Note that here, as in so many cases, a sculpture has been transformed into a painting. Paintings of dressed sculptures of the Virgin proliferated, and we will see many more this afternoon. Native American artists were not the only early painters or sculptors to depict the Virgin in colonial Latin America. Between the 1570s and 1620, 4 professional Italian painters emigrated to the Viceroyalty of Peru, beginning with the Jesuit Bernardo Bitti, who was active in Peru and what is now Bolivia from 1574 to 1610. And he was followed by Matteo de Lecce, Angelino Medoro, and Pietro Paolo Moroni. Lecce was the most celebrated of the 4, since before becoming to Peru in 1590, he contributed to the last fresco in the Sistine Chapel, directly across from Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Bitti had also painted commissions in Rome before leaving for America, and works like this Immaculate Conception reflected the styles employed in the leading Roman churches of the day, like this work on the right by Agostino Ciampelli in the Jesuit headquarters, the Church of the Gesù. Bitti traveled far and wide and founded indigenous art studios in places like Juli, the missionary center on Lake Titicaca, where Andeans were taught to execute Christian paintings and sculptures to put in the giant altarpieces of the many mission churches being built. These altarpieces are known in Spanish as retablos. This painting of the Assumption on the left is in the former Jesuit church of San Pablo in Lima. And here is the full view of that same painting. The elongated bodies, necks, and fingers of the Roman mannerism gave the figures a refined elegance that is enhanced by the luminous pinks, reds, and blues of the figures' clothing and the golden light coming down from above. These paintings were meant to express joy and hope, and Bitti tried to make the Virgin look elegant yet accessible. Bitti's talents were much appreciated in the young colony, not only on the missions, but also in the towns and cities, where his Italian origin had a certain snob value among the elites in viceregal Peru. This exquisite small format Madonna and Child on the left is in a private collection in Lima, and the detail on the right is from the Jesuit college there. Angelino Maduro was a Roman who traveled to Seville in Colombia in 1586, finally arriving in Lima in 1599. In Lima, he quickly gained the patronage of the major religious orders, including the Mercedarians and Franciscans, and he set up a workshop and took on apprentices. One was a Limeño boy named Luis de Riaño, who went on to become one of Peru's most prominent artists. The other was an Andean from Cusco named Pedro de Loaiza, demonstrating a remarkable mobility in an era and place whose racial boundaries were so strictly entrenched. Maduro moved back to Seville in 1620. This Immaculate Conception, done while he was in Lima, has similar characteristics to the Madonnas of Viti: an elongated body, especially the torso, an elegant S-shaped stance, bright colors, and an overall cheerfulness against gold background. The angels on either side hold the symbols of the Virgin's titles in the Litany of Loreto, such as the Mirror of Justice, Tower of Ivory, and House of Gold. A more intimate painting of the Holy Family still has the elongated figures and golden background of Roman mannerism, but is already reflecting the deeper chiaroscuro technique, the light and shadow technique of Caravaggio and Guercino, a dark tonality which brings the viewer closer to the family group and creates a sensation of warmth. On the left stands a Dominican saint and the child John the Baptist, who tells the viewer to be quiet so as not to wake the baby. Viti worked for the Jesuits, and the Jesuits were one of the most active religious orders in the production of artworks in Latin America, particularly by creating indigenous workshops. One of the most important images promoted by the Society of Jesus and their mission, enterprise, and for that matter, throughout Europe, was the Madonna supposedly painted by St. Luke, known as Salus Populi Romani, in the Borghese Chapel at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. St. Luke was traditionally thought to have been a painter and the person who executed the first portrait of the Virgin. He is also the patron of artists. St. Francis Borgia, the third Father General of the Society of Jesus, and particularly promoted this Italo-Byzantine icon, which was credited, by the way, with stopping a plague and also with allowing the Catholic victory over the Turks at Lepanto. Borgia had a copy made of this icon in a slightly updated style, which itself was copied repeatedly over the decades and sent to the four corners of the globe, to Brazil, to Peru, to India, China, and Persia. Another example of an Ajedo Poyetan, the icon and its copies alike were believed to possess miraculous qualities, which aided spiritual conversion. Of course, Borgia's enthusiasm for the image had less to do with art in the Renaissance and modern sense than with the medieval belief that such images possessed the presence of the original, and that copying it extended its spiritual power. On the Jesuit missions known as reductions in Paraguay, Louis Berger, whom we met earlier, the author of La Conquistadora, used the Madonna of St. Luke as the model for a sketch he made to train a Guarani Amerindian apprentice named José Abiu in 1618. Berger painted the sketch in monotones on the canvas that you can see on the right, and Abiu painted over it, adding his own colors. The sketch was found through X-ray imagery and is a fascinating window onto arts training at the missions. Guarani reductions would go on to become the region's most productive artistic centers, especially in sculpture and church furnishings like retablos, as we will soon see. And works like Abiu's were probably meant for a household shrine rather than a large church, given its scale. This Mexican depiction of the same image, here much closer to the Roman original, actually shows St. Luke at his easel painting the miraculous image. Now, although this painting is officially of a saint, it also tells us quite a bit about how real artists worked. You can see his palette with brushes, his easel, and his maul stick, a stick with a soft leather or padded head that was used by painters to support the hand during the paintbrush, the hand while he was using the paintbrush. Juan Correa was one of Latin America's most prolific painters of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The son of a mixed-race doctor from Spain and a free Black woman, his spectacular career demonstrated once again that the racial prejudice of the white ruling classes could be overcome. In fact, Amerindian painters were so successful by the late 17th century in places like Cusco, Potosi, and Quito that they gave Creole or European artists a run for their money. Painters from Potosi and Cusco came to specialize in vibrantly colored and intricately detailed depictions of the Virgin Mary, like the Virgin of Copacabana we looked at earlier, in which Mary is depicted as a dressed sculpture. The indigenous enthusiasm for rich surface decoration and textiles comes to the fore and is so emphasized that the face almost seems overwhelmed by ornamentation. This Virgin of the Victory of Malaga by Potosi Andean painter Luis Niño is typical of this kind of image. The painting depicts a miraculous statue in Malaga in Spain. Because Malaga is a port city, Mary is considered a patron of travel, sailors, and ships. Here, her clothing is covered with a lavish, lace-like pattern of gold tooling, which also incorporates an image of the new moon below. The hang of the Virgin's dress makes it look as though she's standing, but in fact, she sits on a throne to hold the child. The dress's wide triangular shape was designed to hide the throne behind it. Niño would have worked from an engraving of the Malaga Virgin as his model. So the sculpture had already been transformed from a three-dimensional to a two-dimensional image before he had access to it. The painting may also have regional references. When the viewer links the moon at the bottom to the horizontal lines above it, the resulting shape recalls the profile of an Inca ceremonial knife called a tumi, and a pin worn by contemporary Andeans, but originally by Inca princesses or ñustas. Some scholars believe that this was an intentional reference to pre-Hispanic royalty. The scattering of petals and blossoms at her feet have also been related to Andean ritual offerings. Luis Niño worked for the Archbishop of Potosi, and his paintings and sculptures were sought from across South America and as far as Europe for their magnificent attention to detail. Here are two more splendid paintings of dressed statues of the Virgin in the same style, both of the Virgin of the Rosary of Pomata, a miracle working statue in the town of Pomata on the Peruvian side of Lake Titicaca, not far from Copacabana. The Virgin of Pomata is a wooden statue that is in fact very similar in style to that of Copacabana and dates from around the same time, the 1580s. In fact, the two statues were in competition with each other, as the Copacabana church was won by the Augustinians and the Pomata won by the Dominicans. This kind of regional competition between images of the Virgin was quite common. The Virgin of Pomata's popularity is owed to her location on the busy road between Cusco and Potosi, and she is still the focus of crowded annual pilgrimages. It is fitting that these two paintings are by artists from both Potosi and Cusco. That on the left is attributed to Luis Niño, and the one on the right is by the Cusco painter Pablo Chiripupac. Both artists revel in the textural richness of the costume, the pearls, the ribbons, feathers, and flowers, to a degree and a manner never seen in Europe. This depiction of the Virgin Mary will be very familiar as she was chosen for the U.S. Postal Service Christmas stamp this year. I was very fortunate to have been the consultant on this project, and she is the first Latin American painting chosen for a Christmas stamp. We don't know the name of the artist, but the painting was executed in one of the flourishing painting workshops in 18th century Cusco, collectively known as the Cusco School of Painting, which shipped their paintings throughout South America. Like the Virgin of Malaga, this canvas depicts a dressed statue of the Virgin located in Spain. This time, the original Virgin of Guadalupe in Castile, an early medieval statue thought to have been carved by St. Luke. The Virgin depicted here, and the Virgin on the stamp, is a wooden copy commissioned in 1584 by a confraternity of merchants in Quito, present-day Ecuador. The statue was housed in a shrine in the nearby village of Guapulo, and it became a major pilgrimage site. During the last quarter of the 17th century, devotees carried a painted copy of the sculpture throughout the Andean region on a fundraising mission to gather alms for the construction of a new shrine. The painted version was so popular that she became venerated in her own right in places like Cusco, as we see here. The painted version, so once again, as we've seen before, the image went from a statue, a three-dimensional form, to an image, a painting, a two-dimensional form, although in this particular case, probably without the intervention of an engraving. We have already seen several examples of indigenous styles and forms appearing in depictions of the Virgin Mary. The most overt of these, most obvious of these, is the Madonna of the Rich Hill, or Cerro Rico of Potosi, a depiction of the coronation of the Virgin by the Holy Trinity. The pre-Hispanic Andeans venerated large stones and mountains as incarnations of various deities, in particular Pachamama, the Earth Mother deity. The city of Potosi was founded to extract silver from the hill you see on the right, the so-called Rich Hill, and it was at the time the most productive silver mine in the world. Andeans were compelled to work in these mines in horrifying conditions, and many Christian devotions arose as a way for them to seek succor and relief from their labors. This Madonna of the Cerro Rico was one of these devotions. Very unusually for an image of the Virgin, she takes the form of the hill itself, her head and hands emerging directly from its surface, producing a hybrid figure that some scholars believe unites the Madonna as protector of miners with the Andean notion of a hill being the embodiment of the deity Pachamama. Whether or not this is true, the mountain is a conflation of the present and the pre-Hispanic past. On the hill is the Inca Huayna Capac, you can see just to the upper left of the globe there. He is listening to an Andean shepherd named Hualpa, who discovered the mine before the arrival of the Spaniards while tending his alpacas along with his other shepherds. While the Inca is dressed in historical costume, the shepherds dress as they would have done in the 18th century. To the left and right of the mountain are the sun and the moon, which were deities of the Inca state, Inti, the sun god, and Mamakija, the moon goddess. In Inca art, the sun is usually represented as gold and the moon is silver, as they are here. Such suns and moons are obviously common in European depictions of the Virgin, but here they had a particular resonance, and letters from missionaries recorded that Andeans still venerated depictions of the sun and moon in the old way, even with Christian images. At the base of the figure are the long-dead Emperor Charles V and Pope Paul III, a cardinal, a bishop, and a member of the Royal Order of Alcantara, as well as an unidentified Andean noble. Why choose such an odd assortment of figures rather than portraits of contemporary officials? Much about this painting remains a mystery. Many versions of the Virgin of the Rich Mountain of Potosi were painted in the 18th century, and the same mysterious European figures attend at the bottom, some of them in updated dress. Some scholars believe that these represented the patrons of the painting, but to my mind, the faces are too generic, and they've simply updated a Habsburg king with a Bourbon one, acknowledging the change in dynasty in Spain. Maybe these elites are a kind of allegory of Spaniards and Creoles giving thanks for the riches they accrued from the mines, for it was widely believed that the mineral wealth God had bestowed on the New World was a sign of his support of their colony. Therefore, even if these paintings included elements of pre-Hispanic world, they serve the devotional needs of a wide spectrum of the city's population. The Virgin Mary was not just visited in churches and shrines, but played an active role in people's day-to-day lives, particularly during processions, which punctuated the Christian year. In these two paintings from a famous series depicting a Corpus Christi procession in Cusco in the 1670s, we witnessed the Andean confraternities of Saint Rose of Lima and La Linda, the Immaculate Conception, carrying dressed statues of Saint Rose and Virgin Mary on special portable altars known as andas. The view on the right, which is from the last painting in the series, shows two different dressed wooden statues of the Virgin Mary. The parade celebrated not just the body and blood of Christ, but also the different confraternities of the city, who were allowed to be led by a figure dressed as one of the Inca emperors. This was the tradition. Although it might seem odd to include costumes of non-Christian rulers in a Christian procession, the impersonators served to emphasize the affinity noble Andeans had with the Catholic faith, but also to celebrate their ancient noble lineages. One of the most evocative paintings of a statue of the Virgin on procession is this one showing Our Lady of Cocharcas, painted by an Andean artist likely from Cusco. Cocharcas is a tiny village in the highland province of Apurimac in Peru, which has a copy of the Virgin of Copacabana that became the subject of its own devotion and was popular throughout highland Peru. According to the legend, Sebastian Martin, a neophyte Christian, traveled from Cocharcas to Copacabana to cure himself of an injury. The local Jesuits facilitated the voyage, which would have been very expensive. During the trip, Sebastian's injuries were healed, and he devoted himself to the Virgin of Copacabana, commissioning a copy of the statue and taking it back with him to Cocharcas in 1596. What is remarkable about this painting is the way that the larger-than-life Virgin dominates the town, as if it is part of the landscape. She is surrounded by townspeople on foot, horseback, and in canoes, and the background is scattered with houses, barns, shops, and the church. The painting is as much a portrait of the village as it is of the miraculous statue, and the festive atmosphere is emphasized by the gesticulating figures and flowers and jewels bedecking the trees, the posies and vases on the altar, and the richly adorned altar frontal, a rich textile. The painting is so lively that you can almost hear the singing of the choir and the exclamations of the villagers. The devotion to the Virgin of Cocharcas was so widespread that paintings of her appeared in small parish churches and home shrines across the southern Andes. In this case, we have a painting on tin, which was hung in an unknown church and itself became a cult figure. You can see the little tin figures of kneeling faithful that were tacked onto the image by devotees in thanksgiving for her intercession for some malady or danger. At the bottom is the little Baroque church that represents the Cocharcas church. To the left is the figure of Sebastian with his backpack going to Copacabana. And on the right, the figure of San Isidro Labrador, the patron saint of farmers. These devotions for localized images of the Virgin Mary were embedded intimately into the lives of these farmers or villagers. I will finish with two sculptures of the Virgin Mary from opposite sides of South America. Quito was one of the most sophisticated centers for sculpture in Spanish America, and by the late 18th century, Quito produced sculptures on an almost industrial scale, which found their way all over the continent down to Buenos Aires and all the way to Europe. Bernardo de Legarda was Quito's greatest sculptor, and he brought a delicacy and sensitivity to his subjects, especially through robust skin tones achieved by painting in white lead on a mask of silver, as well as dance-like poses and keenly observed facial features. This sculpture depicts Quito's patron, the Virgin of Quito, an unusual depiction of the Virgin with silver angel's wings. The original work was a combination of the iconography of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception and the Virgin of the Apocalypse, and it was commissioned in 1734 and venerated to this day at the altar of the Church of San Francisco, the most prominent colonial church in Quito. The unique wings relate to the story of the woman of the Apocalypse in the book of Revelations. After giving birth, the woman is attacked by Satan in the form of a serpent, and God gives her wings to help her escape. Legarda's figure is remarkable for its dance-like pose, and she is often called the Dancing Virgin. The creature she's dancing on is Satan, the gilded mask with his fangs bared amidst the clouds and the moon. Like so many of the local cults of the Virgin that we've seen this afternoon, she was copied many times, and her copies generated their own devotions, the most important one in the Cathedral of Popayan in present-day Colombia. For our final Madonna, we return to the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay, where beginning in 1608, the Jesuits founded a network of missions in what is now Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. The missions were self-sufficient through farming and crafts manufacturing. In fact, they made so many altarpieces and sculptures that they flooded the market in the southern cone of South America. Although there were many sculpture workshops, it is difficult to trace the origin of individual works, as the churches were sacked and destroyed in the mid-19th century and the sculptures were dispersed. One of the greatest collections today, however, is in the tiny village of Santiago, once the site of a reduction of that name, and we can assume that most of these sculptures probably came from the Santiago church. The sculptures were all made by the Guarani people, who reveled in drapery and surface patterns, and many of the sculptures are of a monumental size, made of a single block of wood. This remarkable Pietà is one of the most extraordinary and moving images to come out of the Guarani workshops. Carved sometime in the late 17th or 18th century out of a single piece of wood, it fuses the figures of Mary and her dead son in a way I have never seen anywhere else. Jesus' body is completely engulfed in her cloak and her embrace, and almost seems to return to the womb when viewed straight on. A very unusual treatment of the subject that I have not seen anywhere else. Her expression is passive, as are so many of the faces in Guarani sculptures, making it look almost as if she is meditating upon the death of her son rather than grieving. Typical of Guarani work, the folds of the drapery are treated with great care, and they're very voluminous, they're very big. This attention to textile patterns is quite typical of the Guarani, and it recalls those of the painters of Cusco and Potosí. But oddly enough, in this part of South America, which is very, very hot tropical environment, the Guarani people didn't wear much at all before the arrival of the Jesuits, and they practiced basketry, ceramics, and body painting rather than large-scale textiles, as you would see in the high Andes of the Cusco and Potosí regions. We have seen this afternoon a network of localized devotional images of the Virgin Mary that were replicated, distributed, transformed from sculptures to paintings, and which formed their own regional cults, often far from the place of origin, and sometimes almost unidentifiable because of their updated styles and media. Veneration of the Virgin Mary was a tapestry woven across the length and width of Latin America. The pilgrimage sites I've discussed this afternoon are still extremely active, and new traditions like the blessings of the taxi cabs in Copacabana are added to ancient ones. In the 20th and 21st centuries, sites devoted to the Virgin continue to proliferate, most dramatically in the relatively recent fashion for monumental statues of the Virgin Mary that can be climbed inside like the Statue of Liberty, and are usually dramatically located on hilltops, visible from the whole city and affording views of the surrounding landscape. Two notable examples are the 130-foot high Virgin of Quito, seen on the right, built in 1975, a gargantuan copy of Bernardo de la Garda's statue in aluminum on the Panecilla Hill near Quito. At the time, it was the highest statue in South America. And on the left is the 150-foot high Virgen de Socavon, Virgen de Socavon, completed in 2013. I was present at the opening, also in aluminum, a Virgin of Candlemas. Like the Quito Madonna, the Virgin of Socavon is a copy of a local devotional image, a 16th century mural painting venerated in a nearby sanctuary, which is worshipped by miners, because this is another mining region, for protection in their dangerous jobs, much as the Virgin of the Rich Hill of Potosí had been worshipped centuries earlier. The Virgin Mary may have been an unfamiliar deity at the beginning, imported in the 16th century by foreign conquerors, but she quickly found an indelible place in the lives, hearts, and faith of the people of the Americas, of whatever ethnicity or socioeconomic level, and she is there to stay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Bailey. And I want to begin with a question really from 10,000 feet. If this is too general, let me know. But if you were to take the 3 centuries that you covered in this lecture in Latin America, and look at those same 3 centuries in Europe, in which the art and devotion to the Virgin Mary was certainly extremely active, could you identify a few trends, developments that were different and distinctive from Latin America compared with Europe?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think the main distinction as we move into the 18th century, especially the later period, is this fascination with really very two-dimensional images that are depicted with a very intense focus on detail, on decoration, on color, on textile patterns. They are, as I explained, usually actually portraits of sculptures, of dress sculptures. But in Latin America, the paintings of these sculptures became very important in their own right, because there was a very strong aesthetic, very strong interest in the aesthetics of textiles, because this region was a very important, especially the Andes, very important textile making area. And so that is one in particular situation that's quite different. Going back to the very beginning of the colonial era, these connections with styles and even occasionally iconographies from pre-Hispanic art that creep in to depictions of the Virgin Mary, and I'm talking really about the early period in Mexico in particular, also make them quite different from what's going on in Europe. So there's really, right from the beginning, a local manifestation of the Virgin that's quite different, even though we're talking about a lot of different peoples, a lot of different regions.
You spoke about certain themes that, or certain kinds of representations of the Virgin, which obviously arise in European art. The Virgin of the Apocalypse, the Lady of Sorrows, the Virgin of Candlemas, presenting the baby Jesus in the temple, the Virgin enthroned, and so on. If you were to take one of those types of representation, as it was in Europe or as it developed in Europe, and look at the way it developed in Latin America, what sort of thing would you find would be distinctive about something particular there?
Now, do you mean visually?
Either visually or in terms of the meaning conveyed, or both.
Well, visually, the main thing would be this transformation from a much more realistic style of painting, one that was trying to emanate emotion, to project emotion, to a much more two-dimensional, more decorative style that was interested in splendor, interested in gold and silver filigree and textiles. And so it's less, I guess the real distinction is it's less mimetic, that is to say, it's less interested in making the figure look realistic, because that was the style in Baroque Europe. We were supposed to really respond to the Virgin Mary and the Virgin Child, and so the paintings were made to look like us. They were meant to be projecting emotion. In lots of parts of Latin America, the interest was less in being mimetic and more in being about who it represents. It represents a holy figure. And this is almost a Byzantine idea of the holy figure having to be different from us, having to look different from us, which is why they become these sort of splendid depictions with a little face hidden away in the textiles, hidden away among the flowers and the different jewels and bouquets. So it's really mimetic on one side and semantic on the other.
And did this reflect or encourage a different kind of devotion?
It was a localized devotion, and I certainly cannot speak for every single region because each region is different. And one of the amazing things is when you get a copy of something like Copacabana that goes to somewhere else, like Ocharcas, and then goes somewhere else, each one takes on its own local resonance, its own local meaning. I think what happens is you get, an image that derives from a European figure, like the Virgin of Cannabis, Virgin of the Apocalypse, who then goes through various versions and gets dispersed into a very localized village level community. And there it becomes celebrated for miracles that happen there in the place. So to people of the village, to events that happen in the history of the village. I'm thinking of, there's an example in the Colca Canyon in Peru, just north of Arequipa, of a church where a copy of one of these other Virgin Marys was there, who was herself credited with saving the church from collapse during an earthquake. And so she then became associated with earthquakes, but specifically with saving that church with an earthquake. That was something that was not part of what she represented in her original location. So that's the sort of thing you get an addition of local aspects, local stories, people, events.
So obviously the original image of the Virgin Mary came from Europe to Latin America, and then with this explosion of different developments. What about the other way? You talked about artists who came to Latin America and then went back to Europe. Perhaps there even were some who were born in Latin America and came back to Europe. Was there an influence either artistically or devotionally from Latin America back towards Baroque Europe?
That's a great question. It's a question all my students ask me, and believe it or not very much. They collected them, they appreciated them, that is to say, European courts and European ecclesiastics, but there was no sort of influence in the other direction. There was one exception, possibly an image of the Virgin of Copacabana that was an engraving of the statue that was rather decorative, that was sent to Italy and had a limited devotion. There's recently been some scholarship about that in Rome. And she is typical of that kind of Cusco school painting we saw, with really rather flat, the small face, and not very realistic. So she had a small kind of following within Rome, but you don't get a kind of you don't get a widespread copying of the style in Europe. It didn't happen. They appreciated them, they collected them, but the needs of European Baroque art were quite different. It was to connect with people and to do that through mimesis and through emotions. And this kind of image perhaps seemed too Byzantine to them, seemed too medieval, but they certainly appreciated the quality and the beauty of them. But it's a very good question. I mean, it's the big question, the elephant in the room with colonial art. It really had very little impact back on the mother country, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. We have this question: why were so many of the paintings of the Virgin actually paintings of statues? Did this have anything to do with not wanting to paint the Virgin herself?
I think probably this also relates to the love of textiles. There's a new book that's just come out by Maya Stanfield Matzi, a fantastic book. I'm about to review it, on the textiles used, the ecclesiastical textiles used to dress the Virgin Mary. So each of these Mary sculptures would have trunk loads of magnificent dresses that changed according to the season, according to the liturgical year. These were as valuable, more valuable than clothing worn by actual people, actual living, breathing people. This is not unique to Latin America. This was true in Spain as well. But because of this interest in textiles that I keep referring to, the paintings wanted to represent the splendor that these textiles added to the original sculpture, rather than kind of this naked image of the sculpture. You take these clothes off the sculpture. I showed you that picture of Copacabana. Yeah, she's dressed, but it's very it's a very plain figure. This adds that sense of splendor, and I think they wanted to project that splendor of the textile. Before the arrival of the Spanish, the Andeans produced the most sophisticated textiles in the world, and that goes back for centuries. And so they had an appreciation for textiles that really resonated through these paintings.
You've referred to this more Byzantine icon understanding of the image in Latin America, which is certainly very fascinating. What do you think accounts for that different understanding of the image in Latin America compared with Europe?
Well, at the very beginning, in both Mexico and South America, religious art was not meant to be realistic. Aztec sculpture, I've shown you a small amount of it, is very vigorous. It's carved in the round. It's big. It has lots of character, but it's not meant to look realistic. It's meant to look like a deity. It's meant to look like something else, something other than human. That makes it more elevated. The Inca also made very, very little. They made even far less religious imagery, and the religious imagery that does survive is even more abstract. I mean, it's just symbols more than figural images, and the figural images that exist are quite abstracted. So the understanding of something holy before the arrival of the Spanish was already that we need to make it look other than us. We need to make it look more like a deity than like a mere human being. It's a form of respect. Now, this is not everywhere the case, because in the cities there were a lot of Creoles and white Europeans who lived there, and mixed race people who also appreciated the European Baroque styles, and some of the imagery we looked at are realistic, like the image we looked at of St. Luke painting the Virgin of St. Luke. So it's certainly not, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but a lot of what makes a lot of the Virgin Marys that seem quite different from the ones in Europe relate to this pre-Hispanic tradition and the pre-Hispanic aesthetic, which continues throughout the colonial era.
Yes, of course. At the same time, you have this then Byzantine tradition of the image not made by hand, of St. Luke being the painter, so that the image itself is more of an expression of divine will.
Yes, and by replicating it, you're bringing some of that sacredness to your replica, and you can keep replicating it and copying it and spreading that sacredness, which is what Francis Borgia was doing with his slightly updated version. He couldn't help himself. He was a Jesuit. He updated it to the Baroque style, but he updated the Byzantine image of the Virgin of Salus Populi Romani, and then those copies proliferated in South America. So it is a Byzantine / medieval idea of this sacred image not made by human hands, possessing the miraculous literally miracle working properties of the original. That when you copy it, it copies or it extends those same miracle working properties. Same with the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Mexican one, which is a version or inspired by the one in Spain, but looked completely different, and was miraculously put on the back of the cloak and therefore not painted by human hand.
Mm. Now, this opens up a very large question, but what about depictions of Christ as the artistic tradition moves through and develops in Latin America? Did they undergo something similar in the way that they're treated by artists, or is there something different there?
It's actually different because of the lack of the textile element. And Christ figures tend to be mostly nude because they're from the Passion or the Crucifixion, so with a loincloth. And you get a lot more sculptures of Christ or the Virgin Mary, but when you do get paintings, they look more sculpture. They're more three-dimensional. You don't get this very often. You don't get this kind of flattened out appearance that you get with the Virgin Mary. So it really seems to be something that's particularly common in images of the Virgin Mary. You do get Christ figures, especially in 16th century Mexico, that have elements that look non-European, that still have this kind of mixture of styles. But you don't get this flattened aspect and this textile aspect like you get with the Virgin Mary. And you don't get as many of them. I mean, you don't get as many different kinds of images of Christ, which is what I was saying about this book that's 300 pages shorter about Jesus, but 650 pages about the Virgin Mary.
Specifically about the original Guadalupe image of 1531. Can you say a little bit about how that relates to Baroque images of the time in Europe, similarities, differences, and so on?
Well, it's actually early enough that it's pre-Baroque. It's late Renaissance, and it relates very closely. As an art historian, I look at it and I think it looks sort of like the Flemish late Renaissance in style. And Flemish style painting was extremely popular in Spain at the time. Mm-hmm. So if you do it purely from an art historical point of view, it looks like it was inspired by the Flemish late Renaissance.
Perhaps this will be a final question. How did the depictions of the Virgin Mary in art in Latin America compare or overlap with depictions in other parts of New Spain, for example, in the Philippines?
Right, that's a very good question. They're quite different in the Philippines, as you would expect. The Philippines really liked sculptures. And so they carved, there's a huge sculpture workshop, mostly by people of Chinese descent, actually, called Sangleyes, in a neighborhood called the Marian outside Manila, which produced sculptures on a grand scale, also retablos for not just the Philippines, but for export. And the emphasis there was on sculptures. And if you visit the Philippines and watch worship of sculptures in the Philippines, people anoint them with oil, they touch them, they're very tactile. And there isn't this fascination with textiles. So it's a very different take on the Virgin Mary. They're magnificent sculptures. And it's a really interesting tradition, but you would never mistake one for a South American or even a Mexican painting. As you rightly point out, the Philippines was directed from New Spain. It was part of New Spain, but there's nothing really Mexican about the style of religious art in the Philippines.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Professor Bailey, both for the presentation and for this this wonderful Q&A.
Thank you very much.
Today. Thank you. And I want to thank our audience as well. And please send us your feedback by filling out the survey that you'll receive by email. Remember that programs offered free to the public are not free to produce, and to help us in the ongoing mission of the Harvard Catholic Forum by supporting us financially through our website. And please do send the survey that will come to you by email. That helps us enormously. And finally, check out the Lumen Christi website for their continuing Hispanic theology series running on Tuesday evenings this spring at 8 o'clock Central, at 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern. Upcoming programs cover Hispanic Christology, the ethics of immigration, and other topics. Thank you for joining in this conversation, and have a wonderful evening.